Luan stood in the cluttered, dimly lit lab, adjusting the final screw on a strange-looking device she'd been toiling over for months. The thick black wires snaked around it like tendrils of some otherworldly plant. Her fingers, pale and slender, were smudged with grease from the intricate circuits she'd soldered together just hours before. It was almost midnight, and she hadn't realized how late it had gotten. The soft hum of the fluorescent lights above her felt almost like a warning in the silence of the room. She blew out a frustrated breath, pushing her messy, ink-black hair out of her face. Her gaze flickered to the worn papers strewn across the desk, notes, equations, hypotheses. Theories that no one believed in, except for her. Luan had always been the dreamer, the eccentric physicist who found beauty in the impossible. But in this sterile, research-heavy world, people didn't have time for things like imagination. Not when they were busy pushing the boundaries of what was practical. It wasn't like she was trying to invent a time machine. Well, okay, she was trying to do that, but not in the way most people would imagine. Her research wasn't about traveling to the past or the future, but manipulating time within localized environments. A way to slow down, speed up, or even loop brief moments of time. Just enough to fix small mistakes, relive the perfect conversation, or avoid a disastrous coffee spill. It wasn't grandiose, but it was something no one had ever done before. Still, no one cared. Not even her colleagues at the university, who had dismissed her theories as whimsical fantasies. Time loops, one of them had snorted a few months ago. That's cute, Luan. Let me know when you invent a time machine. Until then, maybe stick to real science. Luan didn't mind. She knew what they didn't. That time, if understood and manipulated properly, could be both a gift and a curse. Her eyes flitted back to the device in front of her. It was an odd, angular contraption, something she'd designed from a mixture of various failed prototypes. It was deceptively simple, just a few wires, a glowing green core, and a screen that flickered like an old TV. She tapped the button. The hum of the machine intensified for a second, then a crackling sound filled the air. For a brief moment, the world around her seemed to warp. The shadows stretched unnaturally across the floor. Luan's heart skipped a beat, her pulse quickening, and then, silence. She blinked. The room was exactly the same, but something felt off. Her body tingled as though she were standing on the edge of a cliff, the air holding a strange, expectant charge. She glanced at the clock. 11:56 p.m. She could have sworn it was already midnight. Her first thought was that the machine had malfunctioned. But there was no sparking, no alarming beeps or flashes, nothing that suggested failure. Then, something odd happened. She stood there, frozen for a moment, staring at the clock. 11:56 p.m. She blinked again, and then the strange sensation swept over her like a soft wave. Suddenly, everything started over. The same feeling, the same moment. She jerked back, eyes wide. No way. She looked at the clock again. 11:56 p.m. It was impossible. But here it was, plain as day. She could feel the weight of every second in the room stretch out, as though the fabric of time itself had bent. It was as though she had simply rewound the clock. A laugh escaped her. She almost didn't know what to make of it. She reached down and grabbed the coffee cup sitting on the edge of her desk, her hand trembling slightly as she brought it toward her lips. The cup slipped from her fingers and tumbled to the ground, spilling coffee everywhere. A soft curse escaped her lips as she bent to pick it up, but before she could, something strange happened. The room shifted again, flickering like an old film reel. The coffee cup was back on the desk, perfectly intact. Luan's breath caught in her throat. This wasn't just a malfunction. The loop, the repetition, was real. It was a moment of absurdity. She had just looped back in time, without meaning to. A rush of excitement flooded her, followed by a wave of euphoria. This was it. She had done it. She had cracked the code of time. The clock read 11:56 p.m. Again, I did it, she whispered to herself. She took a step toward the door, testing the loop. She opened the door, stepped outside into the hallway, then immediately turned around to step back into the lab. The moment she crossed the threshold again, everything snapped back. Her footsteps retraced. The door closed again, exactly the way it had been. The coffee cup was still there, sitting innocently on the desk. Luan chuckled nervously to herself. Okay, this is just amazing. A few more trials, each more exhilarating than the last, confirmed what she already knew: she could manipulate the passage of time. Just within this small space, but still, time was now hers to play with. She could stop time, rewind it, or stretch it out for as long as she wanted. At first, it was just pure fun. She replayed silly moments, small, innocent mistakes, just to see if she could fix them. A misstep in her presentation? Gone. That awkward comment to a colleague? Reversed. She even tested it on little things, like adjusting her hair, or replaying the precise moment a song she liked came on the radio. The possibilities were endless. A sense of power rushed through her veins, and then the doorbell rang. Luan's stomach lurched. Who the hell would be here at this hour? And why now? She hadn't expected visitors. She stepped out into the hallway, still a little giddy from her experimentation. She walked down the corridor, feeling the odd pulse of the loop still humming beneath her skin. When she opened the door, she was greeted by none other than Zhao Wei. "Oh," Luan said, the words coming out before she could stop them. "What are you doing here?" Zhao Wei, her former classmate, didn't look particularly surprised to see her. In fact, there was a smug glint in his eyes. He was dressed in his usual dark suit, his tie hanging slightly loose, as if he'd just come from some high-profile meeting. "I could ask you the same thing," he said, his voice smooth, betraying no hint of discomfort. "But I know what you're doing. I know you're working on something big. You always were the genius, Luan." She narrowed her eyes, slightly wary. "And you're here to steal it, aren't you?" He smirked, stepping into the room without invitation. "You do have a way with time, don't you?" Luan's pulse quickened. Zhao Wei was a rival, someone she had always felt one step behind. He had no respect for the work she did, always scoffing at her theories, even though he secretly borrowed many of them for his own research. "You really think I'll just let you take it?" she shot back, her voice sharp. "Oh, I'm not taking it. I'm just testing it," he said, his lips curling into a smile that was just a little too knowing. Before Luan could react, Zhao Wei turned toward the device on the desk. He reached for it, his fingers brushing the machine's power button. "Wait, don't," Luan began, but it was too late. The machine flickered, humming with a low, almost ominous sound. Zhao Wei stepped back, startled, but it was already too late. The time loop activated, trapping him in the cycle. For a few seconds, he looked around in confusion. Then, his eyes locked onto hers, the shock on his face turning into realization. He had been caught in the loop. Luan grinned. This was exactly what she had planned. She'd trapped him, just as she had tested her theory earlier. But as she stood there, watching Zhao Wei try to break free from the repetition, something began to happen. The air in the room felt different. He didn't just seem confused, he seemed lost. And then, Luan felt it, too. The world around her began to shimmer again, like the ground beneath her was shifting. Before she could process it, the room fell silent. The clock was still stuck at 11:56 p.m. And this time, Luan wasn't sure if she was the one controlling it. Luan stared at the clock, her heart skipping a beat. 11:56 p.m. Again. Her fingers twitched, and she stepped back, barely aware of her own movement. She had no idea why she felt so disoriented. A moment ago, the world had felt solid, in her control, but now it seemed like the floor beneath her was swaying, as if the very air had lost its stability. The loop hadn't just captured Zhao Wei. It had grabbed her too. Zhao Wei was still there, his face a mixture of confusion and panic as he stumbled in place, his movements jerky, like a puppet caught in a malfunctioning performance. Luan had expected him to react with anger or frustration. He was always so good at masking his vulnerability. But right now, he seemed lost. Completely lost. And in his eyes, she saw something that made her stomach churn. It wasn't just confusion. There was fear. Real, raw fear. Luan's pulse quickened as she stepped forward, trying to think through the dizziness that had begun to cloud her thoughts. She reached out to touch the machine, her fingers brushing the metallic surface, the heat of the device still pulsing beneath her skin. What was happening? It wasn't supposed to do this. Zhao Wei's frantic movements had stopped. He was staring at her now, his gaze sharp and accusing. "What did you do?" His voice cracked, and Luan noticed for the first time just how small he seemed, how much of his usual arrogance had been stripped away by the confusion of the loop. "What I did," she repeated, her voice sounding foreign to her own ears. "I didn't do anything. This wasn't supposed to." Before she could finish, the loop hit again. The room trembled, time resetting with a sharp snap, like a rubber band snapping back into place. Luan felt a wave of dizziness slam into her, and for a moment, she thought she might fall to her knees. She had already seen this moment. She had already spoken those words. It was happening again. The world was repeating itself. The coffee cup, sitting innocently on the desk, was back where it had been the first time. She could feel her breath catching in her chest. Her mind screamed at her to focus, but the confusion was overwhelming. The more she tried to make sense of it, the further the ground seemed to shift beneath her feet. Zhao Wei was still there, still trapped in the loop. But now, his expression was different. His eyes were wide with something deeper than panic. He wasn't just confused anymore. He was frightened. "What's happening?" he asked, his voice barely a whisper. Luan opened her mouth to respond, but she couldn't find the words. How could she explain it? How could she explain the feeling of being trapped inside this distorted, endless moment? How could she explain that she didn't know how to escape? Her thoughts were growing hazier. Every time she tried to focus on the task at hand, on fixing the loop, on stopping this, her mind splintered, as though a part of her was being pulled in different directions. She reached for the machine again, but her fingers felt unsteady. She pressed the button to deactivate it, but nothing happened. The hum of the device became louder, more insistent, filling the room with its rhythmic pulse. Each time the loop reset, it seemed to pull her deeper into its grip. The clock read 11:56 p.m. She was caught, and the realization hit her all at once, cold and brutal. This wasn't just about Zhao Wei. This wasn't just about a prank or proving her theories. This was something much darker. She had made a mistake. A huge one. And now, the loop wasn't just a small, harmless slice of time. It was expanding. Spreading. It was consuming her, piece by piece. A wave of panic surged through her, and she spun around, desperately trying to make sense of the situation. The walls of the lab, her sanctuary, felt closer than they ever had before. The air felt thick, almost suffocating. Her own reflection in the dark glass of the lab windows seemed distorted, like a ghost in a cracked mirror. Zhao Wei took a step toward her, his eyes locked onto hers with an intensity that bordered on desperation. "Luan," he said, his voice shaky but insistent. "This isn't just a mistake. You've trapped us both. You've trapped yourself." She didn't want to listen. She didn't want to acknowledge the truth of his words. But something deep inside her was already starting to accept it. The loop had stopped being a theoretical concept, it had become a reality. And now, it was a prison. Her prison. As the minutes stretched on, they both stood there, caught in the same cycle. The clock read 11:56 p.m. The hum of the machine was all that could be heard, louder now, as though it were echoing inside her skull. Her thoughts were splintering. It was getting harder to focus, harder to keep herself grounded. Her body felt disconnected from the world, as if she were no longer fully in control of it. She felt herself slipping, not just from the moment, but from the very reality she had always known. She was starting to lose herself. Zhao Wei's voice cut through the fog, pulling her back to the present. Luan. You have to stop this. You have to shut it down. He sounded so desperate that it made something inside her snap. She shook her head, as if trying to clear the fog from her mind. She could feel her heartbeat, hammering in her chest. Her hands trembled, her thoughts scattering in 1,000 directions at once. I'm trying, she said, her voice hollow. The words didn't even feel like hers anymore. She reached again for the machine, fumbling with the controls, but each time she thought she had it, the device slipped from her grasp. It was like time itself was fighting her, like the very act of trying to control it was pulling her deeper into its trap. Zhao Wei's eyes narrowed as he watched her struggle. You can't control time, Luan. It's controlling you. The words stung, but there was truth in them. She knew he was right. Luan had spent years theorizing about time, analyzing its mechanics, imagining how she might one day bend it to her will. But now, standing at the edge of the abyss, she realized how naive she had been. Time wasn't something that could be controlled. It was a force, a current, a vast, unknowable thing that couldn't be bent without consequences. And now, she was drowning in it. Suddenly, a sharp pang of realization tore through her. The more she tried to manipulate time, the more she was losing herself. Each loop, each reset, was pulling her further into this fractured version of reality. Zhao Wei wasn't the only one trapped, she was too. The panic rose like a tidal wave, crashing over her in an overwhelming rush. She stumbled backward, clutching at her head, as if trying to hold on to the remnants of her mind. The clock flickered again, but this time, it wasn't just the clock. The walls of the room started to distort. The floor felt like it was swaying beneath her, and the shadows seemed to stretch unnaturally. Every part of the room blurred together, as if time itself were dissolving into a chaotic mess of overlapping moments. Her vision blurred, the sharp edges of reality fading into nothingness. 11:56 p.m. The loop had swallowed her whole, and now, Luan realized, she wasn't just trapped in a cycle of time. She was trapped inside herself. The air around Luan seemed to thicken with each passing second, heavy and oppressive, as if the room itself were closing in on her. The faint hum of the device became a constant, vibrating through her skull, and the faintest flicker of light from the overhead fluorescent seemed to catch in the air, casting twisted shadows that danced along the walls. Her breath felt ragged, uneven, like she was holding it too long between moments that stretched into eternity. She couldn't shake the feeling that she was unraveling, piece by piece. Each loop, each reset, made the world more distorted, more alien. The clocks no longer made sense, the walls seemed to warp, bending like they were caught between dimensions. 11:56 p.m. The clock blinked that time over and over again, a maddening cycle. Her eyes wouldn't focus. The room swirled like it was spinning around her, but when she tried to move, it felt like the air itself was resisting her. She couldn't escape it. The loop had its grip on her now. And the worst part was, she couldn't tell if she was still trapped in the same moment, or if she was falling deeper into another one. Luan, Zhao Wei's voice broke through her spiraling thoughts, and she looked up at him through the haze, still disoriented, trying to make sense of what was real. He had stopped moving. Had he always been standing so still? She couldn't remember. His face was pale, his features tight with the kind of tension that came when someone was teetering on the edge of sanity. But his eyes were still locked on her, sharp with an urgency that felt out of place. "You're slipping," he said, his voice quieter now, almost pleading. This is beyond what you can control. The loop, it's eating you." His words cut through the fog for a second, but only for a second. Her thoughts, fragile as they were, shattered again, replaced by an overwhelming sense of vertigo. I can fix it," Luan muttered, more to herself than to him. Her voice sounded foreign, like it wasn't even hers anymore. I just need to. I just need to. She reached out, stumbling toward the machine, her hands shaking so badly she could barely grip the cold metal surface. Every time she tried to touch it, it felt like she was being pulled backward, as if the room itself didn't want her to make contact. Her fingers brushed the edges of the controls, but nothing happened. The hum only grew louder, like the machine was alive, mocking her attempts, and then it hit her, the horrible, gut-wrenching realization. The machine wasn't malfunctioning. It wasn't broken. It was alive. The thought pierced through her, a cold stab of clarity in the midst of the chaos. The machine had responded to her command, yes, but it had also been changing. Adapting. The loops, the time shifts, they weren't just a consequence of her design. They were becoming a part of her, an extension of her own fractured consciousness. The machine wasn't just altering time, it was warping her perception, her very sense of self. It had begun to pull her apart, to trap her inside a maze of moments where nothing was real anymore, and Zhao Wei, caught in the same cycle, had become an unwilling mirror to her descent. She was dragging him into her madness, whether she meant to or not. Luan, please. His voice was strained now, his eyes wide, desperate. You can't keep doing this. You can't, but she wasn't listening. She wasn't hearing him. All she could hear was the hum. It was louder now, drowning out everything else. And something was off. Her skin prickled, her heart racing, her thoughts swirling in dizzying circles. Luan. Zhao Wei shouted, but his voice felt distant, almost as though it was coming from somewhere far away. You're going to. The loop reset again. She blinked, and when she opened her eyes, the world was back to the way it had been, just as it had been. 11:56 p.m. The coffee cup was in the same spot on the desk, the same soft hum from the machine filled the air. Zhao Wei was standing in front of her, as if the conversation hadn't happened at all. She froze, her breath caught in her throat. It was impossible. Zhao Wei, she whispered, her voice shaking. His eyes met hers, but they weren't the same anymore. There was something hollow in them now, something she hadn't noticed before. His expression was unreadable, but she could see the subtle tension in his posture, the way he was watching her, as if he knew something she didn't. Luan, he said, his voice soft but urgent, like he was trying to hold back something much bigger than he could control. This has to stop. You're hurting yourself. His eyes flickered to the machine, and Luan followed his gaze. The device still sat there, humming softly, innocent and unassuming, but she could feel the weight of its presence in a way she hadn't before. It wasn't just an inanimate object. It was something else now. Something dangerous. She shook her head, not ready to accept the truth. No. No, I can fix this. I can. I just need more time. Just a little more time. Zhao Wei's face softened for a moment, the panic giving way to something else. Was it sympathy? Or was it pity? You don't understand, Luan, he said quietly. The more you try to control time, the more it controls you. You've become a part of this loop. You're losing yourself. The words cut deep, sharper than anything she had felt before. She wanted to scream, to deny it, but deep down, she knew he was right. She could feel it, this strange, creeping sensation, like her very being was beginning to blur, to fade, until she was no longer sure where she ended and the loop began. Her heart hammered in her chest. She had never considered this. The idea that time could become more than a tool, it could consume you, twist you into something unrecognizable. Something inhuman. You're wrong, Luan said, her voice brittle. She tried to move, tried to walk away from the machine, but it was like trying to pull free from a chain that had already wrapped around her mind. She stumbled, her legs unsteady, as the air around her seemed to tighten. I'm not wrong, Zhao Wei replied, his voice steady but insistent. You have to stop before you lose everything. Before you lose yourself. She stared at him for a moment, her breath shallow, before turning away from him, her gaze falling back on the machine. The hum was louder now, like it was calling to her. She could feel the pulse of it beneath her skin, vibrating in her bones. It felt like a whisper in her ear, a promise. But what was the promise? To fix everything? To make it all right? No, the machine didn't want to fix things. The machine was taking. It was draining her, feeding on her desperation, on her need to control. 11:56 p.m. Her vision blurred again, and in that moment, she realized something horrifying. She wasn't just trapped in time, she was trapped in herself. The machine had gotten inside her mind, wrapped its wires around her thoughts, and was slowly rewiring her reality. Zhao Wei was right. This wasn't just a time loop. It was a prison, and she was the one who had built the walls. Her hand trembled as she reached for the machine again. She had to stop it. She had to break free. But with each attempt, she felt herself slipping further away from herself. The loops were more than just repetitions now. They were pulling her apart, making her forget who she was, what she was. Luan, Zhao Wei's voice broke through her thoughts again. She glanced back at him, but his face was fading too, becoming indistinct, like a shadow in the corner of her mind. She took a deep breath, her heart racing. If she didn't stop this, if she didn't let go, if she kept clinging to this illusion of control, she might lose everything. 11:56 p.m. And then she let go. For a split second, the world went still.